In this lecture, I'm going to cover most of the remaining tools of Sculpt mode. So the next tool is the Noise tool. In computer graphics, noise refers to a random variation of color information. So a grayscale image with a noise pattern might look something like this, or like this, etc. Noise patterns are useful in computer graphics whenever you need a random pattern. The Noise tool, for instance, uses a noise pattern to raise or lower the height of the terrain. So as you can see, it's similar to using the Sculpt tool, except that the effect will be applied randomly, based on a random noise pattern, instead of you having manual control. And so the noise scale property is used to set the scale of this pattern. This works just like the texture scale property on the pattern brush that we saw in the brushes lecture to change the size of the default checkerboard pattern that was used. So for example, I'm going to set this property all the way down to 1.1. because it will be easier to visualize the pattern when it's really small. And setting this to 1.0 won't produce any effect, so this is about as small as it will go. So now, when I apply the tool, it will produce this pattern in the terrain. And then if I double the value of the noise scale property to 2.2, it will create the same pattern, but scaled twice as large. With this at the default value of 128, the pattern is large enough to not be noticeable unless you were to view it from extremely far away. Okay, and then the noise mode property is used to specify whether the tool should only raise the terrain, only lower the terrain, or do both, as I've been demonstrating. Alright, so next is the retopologize tool. Unfortunately, this tool doesn't work with the edit layer system. As soon as I select it, I will get a warning in the edit layer section, and then if I try to use it, I will get a pop-up message with the same warning. But in case you ever have a landscape that isn't using edit layers and you want to use this tool, let me explain how it works. So sometimes when you are sculpting your landscape, there might be places where only a few vertices of the terrain get spread out across a large area. This can cause materials to appear stretched in those places. For example, consider this terrain here, which is being viewed in the wireframe view mode. This terrain had the flatten tool applied to it, and as a result, in this area here on the left side of the image, its triangles have been stretched really long and thin, which will cause any materials applied here to appear distorted. So this is what the retopologize tool is for. Whenever this tool is applied, it will grab vertices from areas where there are more of them and pull them towards the areas where there are less of them. In other words, it tries to make the vertex density as equal as possible in all places. The end result is that the triangles will end up less stretched, which will improve the look of any materials applied at that location. One thing to keep in mind, however, is that anywhere the tool is applied will take slightly longer to render. So you don't want to just drag the brush across the entire surface of the landscape. It should only be used in spots where it's necessary. Alright, so next, the visibility tool will be covered in the lecture on landscape holes, so I will skip it for now. And then the blueprint tool only works with a particular plugin, the landmass plugin. But since I'm not covering plugins in this intermediate course, I will go ahead and skip this one for now as well. And so next is the mirror tool. As its name implies, this tool is used to create a mirror image of existing terrain. When it's selected, it will, by default, draw a line going through the center of the landscape. The line will be parallel to the y-axis, so that the x-axis is divided into two halves. There will be an arrow indicating the direction that the copying and pasting will take place in. The arrow will point to the side where the pasting will occur. So if I click the Apply button now, this side of the landscape will be copied, and then that terrain will be pasted on this side, replacing any existing terrain. Okay, so now I'm going to undo this and go over the properties of the tool. If you want to change the location of the dividing line, you can either click and drag on the arrow, or you can set the location directly using the mirror point property. And if you ever want to get the line back to the center of the landscape, you can click this Recenter button. Okay, so again, by default, the dividing line will divide the x-axis and will copy and paste in this direction. But let's say I want to copy and paste in the opposite direction. I can go to the operation property and change its value from negative x to positive x to positive x to negative x. And you can see that the arrow is now facing the opposite direction. So now when I click the apply button, it will copy this side to this side. Or let's say that I want to mirror the y-axis instead. I can change this to negative y to plus y, or the reverse of that. Okay, and then these first four values will mirror the copied terrain, while the last four values will rotate the copied terrain. So for example, I'm going to set this back to the negative x plus x value and click apply again, and notice how the terrain is mirrored so that identical features are directly across from one another. So this feature is parallel to its copy, and so is this one, and so on, just as if the objects were looking in a mirror at a reflection of themselves. But now I'm going to undo this and change the value to rotate negative x to positive x. And now when I click apply, instead of producing a mirror image of the copy, it will be as if this side of the landscape was copied and then rotated 180 degrees. So this feature's copy is over here, and this feature is over here, and so on. Okay, but one issue that can occur with the mirror tool is that sometimes the places where the two halves meet can appear rough, sharp, or unnatural. For example, if I temporarily switch to a different tool and we look at where the dividing line was between the two halves, we can see this jagged seam running through the landscape. So to solve this, I can use this smoothing width property. When this property has a value above 0, smoothing will be applied to the seam. The higher the value, the more the seam will be smoothed. So I'm going to undo the last mirror, then change the smoothing width value from 0 to 15. And then I'm going to click apply again. And now the seam is a lot smoother and much less apparent. Alright, so next is the region selection tool. This tool can be used to paint a mask onto specific areas of your landscape to temporarily prevent those areas from being edited. So for example, let's say I have this hill here, and I really like how it looks, and I don't want to change it, but I do want to edit the area immediately around it. I could just try to be careful and work around the hill, but it can be easy to make mistakes, and having to be careful will also slow me down. So what I'm going to do is select the region selection tool, and then I'm going to left click and drag to paint a mask on the hill. And if I want, I can let go of the mouse, move to a new area, and click the mouse again to continue painting. And if I make a mistake and paint too much, I can hold down Shift and left click and drag to erase the mask. So now, as long as this area is selected and the Use Region as Mask property is true, the area won't be able to be edited by the other tools. So for example, I'm going to select the Sculpt tool, and I'm going to apply it all over the place here. But no matter how many times I drag the brush over this hill, it won't be affected, because it is masked. And the same goes for any other tool. So I'm going to try the Flatten tool, and that won't work in that region either. And if I had a landscape material applied, and I switched over to paint mode and tried to paint onto the landscape, I wouldn't be able to paint the hill either, only the areas around it. Okay, and then when you're done with the selection, instead of using Shift plus left click to manually erase it all, you can just click this Clear Region Selection button, and it will erase it all at once. Okay, and then let's say instead of just masking a small portion of the landscape, you actually wanted most of it masked and only a small portion to be unmasked. In that case, you can uncheck this negative mask property, which will cause the entire landscape to be masked. And then from there, you can left click to use the tool to unmask areas of the landscape. And so now, this hill is the only part of the landscape that can be edited. Alright, and then finally, there is the Copy Paste tool. This tool is used to copy and paste regions of terrain. So when this tool is selected, it will create a volume in the level, known as a landscape gizmo. The gizmo is used to enclose the areas of your landscape that you want copied, and it can be moved just like any other actor. So for example, I'm going to move the gizmo here. And it can also be resized, either using the scale property or the width, height, and length Z properties. And now, if I click the Copy Data to Gizmo button, or use the shortcut Ctrl-C, it will copy all of the landscape geometry that falls within the bounds of the gizmo. And now I can move the gizmo again to wherever I want to paste the terrain. And there are a few different ways to paste. Probably the easiest way is to simply use the shortcut Ctrl-V. Alternatively, you can use the Gizmo brush, which is a special landscape brush only available when using the Copy-Paste tool. When this brush is selected, left-clicking anywhere in the viewport will cause any active data in the gizmo to be pasted. And then finally, you can use any one of the other brushes to manually paste in the terrain gradually. So for example, if I select the circle brush and left click and drag, it will paste in any of the copied terrain that I dragged the brush over. Okay, and then this tool has this property paste mode, which is similar to the other mode properties we've seen. You can set this to lower, which will only paste in features that lower the terrain, to raise, which will only paste in features that raise the terrain, or to both, which will paste in everything. Okay, and then with this property, Gizmo Copy Paste All Layers set to true, it will copy and paste not just the height data, but also any painted on materials. If this is set to false, it will only copy and paste the height data. Alright, so as we saw in the Landscape Manage Mode lecture, the landscape is divided into a grid. And so when the landscape gizmo is moved around, it's possible that it will be moved to a location that doesn't align with this grid. If this happens, it can cause the terrain that is pasted in to appear blurry at the edges. So if this becomes an issue, you can use this Snap Gizmo to Landscape Grid property so that no matter where you move the gizmo, it will snap to the nearest points of the grid. With this set to Component, it will snap to the intersections between components. With this set to Texel, it will snap to each individual pixel of the height map of the landscape. Okay, and then another problem that can occur is that when terrain is copied from one area where it was created naturally and blends perfectly with its surroundings, and is then pasted to another area, its edges can appear too sharp. To get around this issue, this Use Smooth Gizmo Brush property is set to true by default, which will smooth the edges of the pasted terrain into the existing terrain. But this can be set to false if you wish to paste in the terrain as is. Alright, so instead of positioning and resizing the gizmo directly to define the area you want copied, you can actually use the Region Selection tool to paint the area you want copied. So first, I'm going to click this Clear Gizmo Data button to erase the data in the gizmo. And then I'm going to select the Region Selection tool. And now, let's say that I'd like to copy just this hill here. All I need to do is paint a mask over it, click back to the Copy Paste tool, and then click this Fit Gizmo to Selected Regions button, and it will automatically position and size the gizmo so that if I were to click Copy Data to Gizmo now, it would copy all of the terrain that I painted. And I just want to point out that the Fit Gizmo button doesn't work based on the area that gets masked, it's based on the area that gets painted. In other words, with the negative mask property enabled on the Region Selection tool, it will use the area that is masked. With the negative mask property disabled, it will use the area that is unmasked. Alright, and now I'm going to clear everything out, and I'm going to resize the gizmo to be really tall. And now I'm going to move it somewhere randomly and copy the terrain. So now I have my copied terrain, but if for some reason I wanted this terrain to be equal in height to my gizmo, I could click this Fit Height Values to Gizmo Size button, and the copied terrain will be scaled so that the highest point of the terrain matches the height of the gizmo. All right, and that will conclude part 2 of the Landscape Sculpt Mode lecture.